Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Shinobi 3. In the last part we got through, I think, just stages 4 and 5, and now we're on to the endgame stages, stages 6 and 7 in particular. And stage 6 starts off pretty dangerously, as we are in a vertical autoscroller. These rocks slowly fall from the top of the screen, and you need to use them as platforms to make sure you don't end up in the bottomless pit below. With that said, the moment the rock goes off screen, it's not counted as gone. You have maybe an extra second or two, depending on the falling speed of the rock, to jump off it before it's actively counted as a bottomless pit. So they're at least a little bit generous with that. Additionally, very few of the jumps here require the double jump, especially like for distance reasons. But there are one or two, so make sure you're getting comfortable with at least doing running jumps. Running single jumps rather, with the occasional double jump thrown in there for spice, just to make sure that your reflexes are ready for when the actual ones are needed. You also want to be careful if you're trying to jump to the platform to a platform that's partially still above the screen, as there is a non-zero chance that there will be an enemy camping on that rock that was going to be there anyway, like the one I just killed right there, meaning you'll either get hit and fall into the bottomless pit or back onto a previous rock, or you'll just suffer no touch damage and the same will also happen. Thankfully, the flying enemies that come in from off-screen, I think they tend to only spawn on the right side of the screen anyway. Oh no, there was one on the left just there. Or wait, no, where's that guy on the platform? Either way, thankfully their shurikens move at such a speed that as long as you are paying attention to where they are, you shouldn't really have trouble with them themselves. If anything, they're more dangerous for accidentally running into them, meaning that, oh no, you'll accidentally potentially fall down. That sucks. Oh god. Oh boy. And once you're here, you're not quite at the end of the stage yet, actually. No, I am thinking ahead a little bit. Problem with this kind of stage design, you can only roughly tell how close you are to the end of the stage, I believe, by the very far background layer. As you can see, we're getting close to what look like some mountains there. Alright, now we're on to the mini-boss, which is this weird bird man. With that said, the bird actually doesn't show up until you hit the cycle of feathers that shows up once, at which point then it becomes an actual fight. The cycle of feathers will just try and hit you across the screen. All it does is move in various looping patterns. But eventually, when you do hit it, it does become the bird guy, in which case it'll do various swipes with its scythe. At least I think it's a scythe. That's a spear. It can just do straight up stabs. It'll try and do long distance sweeps across the floor. There's a couple of annoying attacks it can do. With that said, because it's in such a predictable pattern where it's always the feather loop and then it starts at the center of the screen, it leaves itself open to so much damage that even if you just throw shurikens from a distance like this, as you can see, the boss doesn't get to do much unless it decides to be super aggressive, which in my experience isn't super common. Additionally, you can't get knocked off to the left or right of the left or right platforms, I believe, as, well, those are technically invisible walls. Just stick on those platforms and you're safer than you would be on the center platform, at least. With that said, the rest of Stage 6 is a bit of a return to something from Revenge of the Shinobi, particularly the labyrinth from the final stage of that game. We are in a trap house, to put it bluntly. There are going to be doors that we need to enter in order to progress on, but there are some doors that lead you back the way you came, lead to trap rooms that maybe have just maybe an item in them, or otherwise. Your duty is to figure out which the true pathway is. For instance, jumping on these boxes instead of destroying them in order to find this door over here. The only door I'd say that's hard to find is potentially in this room here. Also, make sure you're blocking when walking around here, because that's the only way to block these arrows. And that's because in this area is one of the few required uses of ninjutsu in the game. You need to use Fushin in order to double jump up here and climb onto this ceiling. Again, I think there's technically like two ways to finish like two main pathways you can do to get through this area. I just think this is the fastest from memory. It also serves for good double jump practice, or not double jump, wall jump practice. Because as you can see, you got a lot to deal with here, and you want to be careful of the spikes at the top especially. and it's especially, to me, a pain in the ass, as during my practice run, I got through this room flawlessly. Of course, that means during the main run, the opposite would happen. I believe you don't want to fall right where I just was, though, on those falling platforms, as I don't think there's a bottomless pit there, but I think you're stuck down there and have to go another way in the maze, and, well, that's just rough, buddy. Yeah, the spike hitboxes here can be a little more generous, but oh well. Thankfully, these aren't instant kill spikes. This, in particular, is one of the more dangerous rooms. Not because of the ninjas as you'd initially suspect, but because we eventually have the crusher spikes from certain castles in Super Mario World to deal with. And if you're on them when they activate, it is still instant kill like those ones in Super Mario World. With that said, the only way to easily avoid them is by standing on the very tippy edge of the platform they're on, so as far to the right and the left as the platform as you can be without falling off of it, really. And that can be tight platforming, to put it lightly. With that said, we're already near the end, and there's a bunch of spikes on the right side of this room. You can double jump and climb on the ceiling to get to a treasure trove over there, but it'll require me to backtrack to the dungeon again. And with that, now we're facing the final boss of Revenge of the Shinobi. Two of them, sort of. One of them is a shadow clone of sorts that takes no damage. The only way you can tell which one's the real one is by attacking the fake one. Because of that, this fight can be kind of annoying. With that said, the only attacks this fight has is to appear and fling arrows at you through both the shadow clone and original. The best case scenario here is hope they show up next to each other, like on the square I'm behind and the one to the left or right of that, or vice versa on the top, as if you shoot at the fake boss, it'll still hit the real boss because your shuriken will continue through the fake one. This fight is random and annoying, and I don't care for it too much. Thankfully, I'm nearly dead, and we're moving on to phase 2, where the boss is a bit more active in trying to kill you. In this phase, it has 3 different attacks depending on where it spawns in the room. If it spawns on the bottom left or right, it's going to throw its fans in the air, which will then home in on you in various ways. If it spawns in either of the middle tiles, it will just swing arrows around like in the last phase, but if it spawns in on the top left or top right, it'll bounce along the top floor while making spikes appear below him as he walks. That attack in particular is very hard to avoid. That fight is random, and I got lucky there, to put it lightly, because if I had gotten any of the top attacks, that could have just ended poorly. With that said, we're now moving on to the final stage, stage 7. And this stage is a marathon, to put it lightly, with some pretty kick-ass music. Again, this game's soundtrack is absolutely phenomenal. The first part of the stage has you clinging onto pipes, as we have so far in the game, but you need to be a bit careful of the thrusters in this stage, like this one, as the hitbox is a bit wider than the actual sprite is, and the awkward thing about climbing on things, like with the Shinobi in this game, is you can't exactly move slightly, you can only move in full arm radiuses. So I could say only move left arm to right arm like that. You can't do half of those or a third of those, so you're stuck into more or less like 2 or 3 tile width movements, meaning it's very easy to just lead yourself into something and getting hit. Now, while I go through this stage, something I found out while doing some research on the game and like the cutting room floor in between parts is the game does have a debug mode, but it's hidden more or less in the game's code so well you need to use a Game Genie code to get to it. I think there's a different Game Genie code depending if you're playing in the US or Japanese version. That's one of those codes you can probably find very easily just by finding it. In fact, I think it was on the cutting room floor page. But using that debug mode allows you to do some interesting things. For instance, there's just a straight up level select you can do by pausing and then I think pressing A, B, and C on the controller. And I think at that point, underneath the lives counter, you can just move a number up and down to choose which stage to go to. Additionally, I think there's just a straight-up level select where I think you press, I think it was B on controller 2, it may have been C on controller 2. And weirdly enough, and I don't get why this is in here in particular, there was a frame advance, which I guess didn't Sonic 3's debug mode have something like that too, now that I think about it. Either way, on controllers 2, I think you pressed start and then A. Which, I mean, hey, that probably was handy making TASes for the game. Now, this is, out of the early portions of the stage, potentially the most dangerous section, as these giant laser cannons fire very rapidly, and the only way to know there's one coming ahead is by destroying the earlier ones and listening for the sound effect. Thankfully, you can destroy them. I can think of basically any other game I played from this generation that's this type of game, you wouldn't be able to do that. Ninja Gaiden, you wouldn't be able to, that's for certain. Mega Man, you probably would, now that I think about it. But still, taking them out saves you a headache and a half, and thankfully, they go down to just 1 or 2 melee strikes. That said, one other thing you need to keep in mind, especially with some of these enemies, like these cannons right here I'm taking out, or the odd flying enemy who will spawn out of the top left of the screen occasionally. The vertical movement and shaking of the stage does play an active element in the altitude of projectiles, so make sure that you can duck under certain projectiles before actively doing it, if that makes sense. Because, say, if one of the diagonal cannons fires upwards, but you're also moving upwards, the chances of you getting hit by that particular projectile just more or less doubled, if not tripled, or never tell me the odds. I'm not good at math. It was never my specialty back in school of any sort. More so, I was the science kid, or I somehow became the English kid, sort of, in college. That wasn't how it was in public school at all, I'll tell you that for a fact. I think I mostly have to thank that mythology class I took for that. Either way, welcome to what is without a doubt the hardest section in the game. We have here a super long chain of platforming challenges that if you die, I believe you're sent right back to the beginning of the room. Every platforming thing you've done in the game is going to be tested here. Climbing on things, be it the ceilings or the ropes, wall jumps, short hopping, anything. This area is rough. Thankfully, barring bottomless pits, the electricity doesn't hurt too much. I think it takes more than one hit for it to do even 1 unit of health to you. With that said, still be careful. This is hard. In fact, this section right here is why I warned you to get used to wall jumping, as it's pretty tense. With that said, this is also potentially my favorite section in the game because it's probably the one part of the game I'd say the difficulty lies entirely in well-done platforming level design that's a fair kind of hard, rather than that combined with potential enemies that do more damage, hazards that kind of come out of nowhere, or even some interplaying of those few elements. This feels really good to nail. It's like the mid-game of Ninja Gaiden 1 before the final stage kind of ruins that game's difficulty curve, more or less. Where the platforming combined with everything just feels so good. These platforms right here are potentially the biggest threat on a first run, as these, I think, are supposed to be missiles you're like launching out of the thing by jumping on them. And you need to time your jumps pretty precisely on them, especially right there, as if you jump too high, you're gonna hit the electricity, and if you do that, well, you're probably gonna get knocked back into the bottomless pit. Going for that life isn't worth it, by the way. I've died getting that one more times than I have actually gotten a bonus life. And even then, there's the law of, what's the rule called? Do the running jump there, by the way, to save some time. What's the rule called where, oh, what is it? It's where, say you want to get an extra life in a video game. You go for it the first time and die. You still want to get it because at least then you'll be at a net 0 for life count. But then if you die a second time, it's no longer worth going after because you're net -1 at that point anyway. What is that rule called? It's not Gambler's Fallacy. At least I don't think that's Gambler's Fallacy. Oh, that's gonna bother me. Oh, shit. What is that? Or, wait, is there even a term for that? Isn't that just negative return? We are coming up, I believe, on what's potentially the most annoying part of this set, though. As you might have noticed, we have platforms here going along tracks in the background, and now the tracks are going to start going into the electricity, so you need to time a jump so that you jump right before it enters and come back down right after it gets out. My best advice is to just do a double jump there, but honestly, that timing is... It's rough. That's easily the hardest section here. Thankfully, once we get to this next room coming up here, we are on a checkpoint. Just make sure to not mess up these last jump timings, and you're fine. The next room, though, is also kind of stressful, but for a different reason. It's a crusher segment where you need to rapidly double wall jump off the crusher and the wall that we're being crushed against. I forget exactly how much time you have here. It's probably about 30 to 40 seconds. But either way, it's a tight time limit, especially if you mess up and get hit by the electric walls you have no way of seeing coming. Thankfully, they're pretty kind with the placement of these, where if you get between two of them, you're generally going to get between the next one and the one above it. Still, that timing there, a little bit rough. That room can suck on a first playthrough. Thankfully, though, platforming's done. From here on, it's all final boss. This is... I guess this is Neo Zeed or the Dark Shinobi. Either way, this thing has almost your exact same moveset. It can throw shurikens at you in triple spreads, which is the only way to avoid that is getting close. It can double jump and do the 5 spread. It can block your attacks even. And you need to be careful if you go for melee attacks on this. As you can see, it can guard your attacks, but eventually it'll charge up for a close-range explosion attack that you need to jump away from. This fight can be a marathon, especially when we eventually reach Phase 2. But honestly, if you've saved up enough lives over the course of the game, my best advice is to, if you get too low, just use the Mijin ninjutsu. You'll sacrifice a life, yes, but you'll save your HP and recover to max health, and potentially do more damage to the boss. I think if you use certain ninjutsu, it just teleports behind you and taunts you, basically. In Phase 2, it turns into Lord Zed from Power Rangers, and gets much more aggressive with its moves, even throwing explosions to you as it jumps. It's a very vanilla moveset, it even gets a Shoryuken, but it's one that, given your abilities, can cause a lot of damage to your health bar, given how close range you might tend to be in this game. It's a fair final boss, it's a hard final boss, but it's one I think is really good for the mechanics the game has, as long as you brought in some lives as stock to you sacrifice away, basically. Honestly, I don't think I've ever done this boss fight on a single health bar. It feels like, while not impossible, that would be asking too much of most players. The background's also extraordinarily trippy, and I admit, I like it. Otherwise, though, the boss doesn't really do anything new that we haven't seen already. The biggest thing to fear this phase is potentially the Shoryuken, as it comes out pretty quickly. At this point, though, game over. The battle has ended. The wing of darkness burns and shakes the earth as it lands. The silent wind gently surrounds Musashi and comforts his wounded body. In this world of confusion, evil will continue to thrive and will rise again one day. When history takes another turn, there will be a man running in the darkness. He will be a shadow. He will be a shinobi. And that's Shinobi 3. I said some of my thoughts basically back in part 1, but honestly, this is the best Shinobi game. Between the stage mechanics, how much Joe can do in this game, and how well the level design complements your moveset, it is such a confident action platformer. With that said, I would also argue this is, if not the hardest mainline Shinobi game, the second or third hardest, as the game throws everything at the kitchen sink at you along the way. This is a game that on a first playthrough will probably wreck your shit and will continue to do so even after you've beaten the game. Particularly, I tend to still have troubles in stages 3 and 5-ish. And there are some bosses, as you can see, that still give me trouble to this day. I nearly died on the second to last boss. It was clear as day. This game's soundtrack is just phenomenal, arguably some of the best on the Genesis, and it also looks fantastic for the system as well. This might be, honestly, in my top 3 or 5 Genesis games. This is a super, super solid game, period. With that said, we're not done with the Shinobi Marathon yet. We got one more game to go. We're hopping over to the Sega Saturn for the only game the series got at that point, which almost sort of killed the series until it came back on PS2 with the action game, and then you got Nightshade. I think the second one of those was called, and then what's after that? The 3DS game, I think. There's not many of these games left at this point. I've done most of them. Kind of a shame this series kind of fell by the wayside as the years went on. I know I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I think this series is really solid. Obviously, the early days on consoles were a little bit rough, but by the time you reach the Genesis onwards, I think most of these games are worth playing. If you want to play this, it's on the Genesis, and I think it was available on most of the virtual consoles. Obviously, the Wii's is down, but I think it might be on the Wii U and 3DS virtual consoles? Let me look that up really quick. I think Wikipedia would have that on a very quick cursory examination. Let's see here. Sega Genesis Virtual Console in 2007 on the Wii, as well as the eShop on the 3DS in 2013. On Steam for the Genesis collection on that in 2010, and on iOS? Really? Okay. I didn't expect that. Also, I should note, unlike most games of this genre, of this rough difficulty, of this rough era, this game's ending does not change at all, I believe, on higher difficulties. I don't think the text crawl at the end changes. The to be continued doesn't become the end, unlike Shadow Dancer on Genesis. I believe no matter which version you play, this is what you see, no matter which difficulty. And you know what? I appreciate that. Either way, with that, I'm gonna need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, have a great night, take care, and I'll see you guys next Let's Play, whatever that may be. What do you mean I just said about 2 minutes ago that it was gonna be Shinobi Legions on Saturn? Shut up! See you guys then.